Hello, my little Luxes. This is another episode of Luxxxy Charms, and I'm your host, cosplayer Charcy Lux. And this is a very different episode, although I think I say that probably about every other episode now. But today we are actually going to be talking the true crime and the story of Elizabeth Bathory. So, hello and welcome if this is your first episode of Luxxxy Charms. And like I said, wanted to get into an episode that would be dealing with true crime. The thing is that I've been kind of nervous about doing this episode because anything that I have been doing has been like reviews or ghost stories, things on that element, which becomes opinionated pieces, of course, but it's my opinion. So where you're talking about true crime and you're going into history and things like that, you want to try and have the facts. You want to be right about, but let's be fair. So when we talk about the story of Elizabeth Bathory, this is a case that happened 400 years ago. This is a 400-century-year-old case. And when we want to think about it, why after all this time and all these years, why are we still talking about Elizabeth Bathory? Why is she so important? Well, even in, I want to say, the Guinness Book of Records, she is labeled as one of the most prolific murderers, or I should say prolific female murderers of the whole entire world. So that's why she's brought up. And she is still brought up as a ghost story in herself, and the idea that she could be a vampire, and the idea that she is the Blood Countess, and that she could have very well stemmed the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. But why did I decide that in the month of June to talk about Elizabeth Bathory? Well, it just kind of came to mind where, I've always been fascinated by her story. She's been in a ton of, as a character, I should say, she's been a character in several horror movies that I've recently watched. And the one that came to mind, which I did do a review on, and hopefully you watched it and have seen the movie and the review on it, but I did 2006 Stay Alive. And obviously it's very loosely based off of the true story of Elizabeth Bathory from that standpoint, but it kind of stemmed from there where I had put it in my queue and I had remembered, and it's like, oh yeah, the whole story of Elizabeth Bathory, which had also recently, I want to say about a year ago, Bailey Sarian, who does true crime and makeup videos, she had also talked about Elizabeth Bathory. But me doing the investigating that I had done and deep diving into just different accounts from other people, listening to documentaries, especially on YouTube, and I went on a roller coaster that I was not expecting where the ending of the ride ended up, because I'm going to bring up the idea of what if Elizabeth Bathory isn't the murderess that we all think she is and have been told for centuries at this point? What if she was innocent? And yeah, there's something that is completely mind-blowing to think about. So I'm just gonna I'm gonna basically try and skim the surface of everything and go into, I'm not a historian, so obviously this just becomes hearsay. This is kind of an opinion, but because of all the research of going back and seeing what other people and their accounts and their research and their sources. So I'm going to link them in their YouTubes down below, and especially Illuminati, because once going through hers and all of her research, especially all her sources, it's like, oh my God, have we been told wrong for so many years? And as they always say, history is hearsay, or his story. So come with me on this very strange, very rocky ride of learning about Elizabeth Bathory. And is she really the blood countess that we've been led to believe that she is? Don't mind me as I try to reassess myself for something completely different, because like I said, I'm a little nervous about this one, because this is one of those where it's like you're bringing forward some type of evidence to a case that happened 400 years ago, and why the hell, Charcy, do you feel this way? Well, let's get into the story of what I found in the research and why we have come to this different conclusion to what apparently there is a group of researchers that feel that she is innocent, and we will find out why. Elizabeth Bathory, or I believe it's pronounced in her original tongue as Elizabeth Bathory. As always, I apologize for butchering any names, and these ones I am going to butcher, not on purpose, of course. She was born on August 7th in 1560, and in the Kingdom of Hungary, which now would be known as Slovakia, or Slovakian area that she would be in today's standards. And her death was in August 21st of 1614, and Elizabeth Bathory was born to a wealthy family, the Bathory family, of course, and that their noble family was just as rich, if not as more well known as the Habsburg family at the time in the Kingdom of Hungary, and that supposedly she suffered from epilepsy and that she was very sick, and that supposedly this would have been about the time that they say that she could have learned her love for the taste of blood, because back then they would do these strange concoctions, and that they would mix like the blood of a person and would mix it with a concoction of other strange things, like a piece of a human skull, and other items were added to it, and that they were supposed to be able to drink this concoction, and it was supposed to make the epilepsy go away. And supposedly they try to say that her epilepsy is due to the fact that her parents were basically cousins, that this is supposed to be the reason why, that because of inbreeding that she has epilepsy. Now mind you, that's not to say this is why everybody has a form of epilepsy and other problems and issues like that. They're just trying to state that in this case that this could be a strong possibility. But also, if you look at the actual family tree of Elizabeth Bathory and her parents, they are so far removed as cousins. Like, they're like 7th generation, which is like, I want to say 200 years worth of time frame gone by. So the possibility of inbreeding is actually nil, like doesn't even exist. It's just something that a lot of people, I think, like to focus on, like, oh, they were cousins, they were related, which was very common in nobility. Yes, that is true. And yes, that was a problem for some nobility. But in this case, they are so far removed as cousins that I do not think that this is the case in this scenario. And it is also said that her parents would find very brutal ways to reprimand their servants. Now, 400 years ago, this was at a time that people had indentured, as long as I'm saying that right, indentured servants. So these are people who are servants because they owe the crown, or they owe the nobility of that area, and they all live as a community in a town in the courtyard, but they are owned essentially by the nobility of that place. So the families would find certain ways to punish the people who have done wrong to them. And supposedly there's a story in the past where that there was a gypsy man who had stolen from Elizabeth Bathory's parents, and as a punishment against this man, they sewed him up into the belly of a dying horse. Now, to her as an 11-year-old child, apparently when she was witness to this, that a normal child would probably be terrified, but on records they try to say that Elizabeth Bathory was fascinated by this, and that you could even see the child that she was laughing at the fact that this man was being sewn inside of this horse. Now me, if that was me seeing something like that, I would be petrified as a child, and I would be like, yeah, I don't think I'm ever gonna misbehave for my parents.
No, Mommy and Daddy, please don't sew me into that horse. I swear I won't break the good china again.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was a thing, supposedly. Supposedly, she had also learned her very bad habits, or I guess her murderous tendencies, because of a sadistic uncle, and also from an aunt that was a pseudo-masochist. So in other words, that is somebody who gets off on torturing other people or inflicting pain on others. So supposedly she had learned some traits from these two, that at the age of 11, she was set to be engaged to a young man by the name of Fernick. Now, I apologize if I can't say Fernick or Fernick. Nadesty? But Fernick. So they were about 5 years apart. But it wasn't until she was around the age of 14, 15 that her and Fernick had gotten married. So I want to say that she would have been 14 and he would have been about 19 at that time that they finally would have been married. And it is said that the Habsburg family, so the royal crown, saw this as, a slight against them, because the Bathory family decided to marry within the Bathory confinement of the family again. So he was a distant cousin, of course, again, very distant. And the Habsburgs saw this as a slight against them. And it is even said that they did seize some of the land, that, the crown can kind of do that. Because they saw it as a slight, they seized the land and some property from the Bathory family, and that her and her husband Fernick had 8 children together throughout their marriage. And Fernick is actually kind of more well known on the fact that his young predecessor is Vlad the Impaler. So Fernick is technically seen as he's a military ruler from the Kingdom of Hungary. And this was during the Turkish Wars, and not everybody knows who Vlad the Impaler is, which I thought he was actually the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, which I guess stems to the point of the Bathory family as well. But you have Fernick, who was seen as a very terrifying military leader, and that he took great pride in torturing his enemies and, of course, putting their heads on a spike in order to terrify their enemy countries. So there could be some relations there. There was also some tales where they were saying that Elizabeth Bathory learned her rage and her torturous ways because of her husband. There's been accounts of them trying to say that when they got married, his present to her, besides the fact that, he gave her a castle. So when they got married, one of the inheritance was the fact that his family gave them a castle. But that he supposedly, Fernick, had developed a private torture room for Elizabeth Bathory in this castle, which I think supposedly was in the basement of the castle. But we'll get more into the whole torture dungeon and everything as we go along with this. Fernick had died in January 4th of 1604, and that it's not completely known what he had actually died of, but that it was said that he had complications in his legs and a lot of pain when he had his death. So, and that supposedly it lasted for years, that it wasn't just like a split, something had happened and that he had passed, that he had suffered for several years before he had finally succumbed to his illness. And I'm sure that if they did some investigation now, they could kind of maybe take some guesses on what it could have been, but back then they had no idea what was wrong. Now, it is said around just before Fernick had passed away in 1604, that he had called upon his friend, Gregory Thurzo, and had him promise, can you please watch over my wife, Elizabeth Bathory, after I pass away? And so that was supposed to be a promise. Thurzo was actually a family friend. Now, Gregory Thurzo is the Palatine of Hungary, which means he's the main officer of the crown. And the crown was King Matthias II at the time. Now, a lot of accounts will try to say that her span of crimes and torture and murder spanned from 1590 until she was apprehended in 1610. The accounts of saying how many women, because obviously she didn't go after men, that she supposedly went after young women, girls, and that usually her favorite age to go after was from age 10 to 14. Now, we need to remember that this was a different time back then, that 10-year-olds to 14-year-olds were technically seen as adults by that point in time. It's not the same standards that we have in today's world. But they were still youthful, they were still young, they were still possibly even virgins at that time. And that's where the whole story of Elizabeth Bathory stems from, was the fact that they said that she would drink the blood of the young girls and that it would give her youth. But it also stemmed the story and the rumor that she used to bathe in the blood because supposedly the blood would keep her youthful. One of the stories that stemmed from it was from a story of that Elizabeth Bathory was having her hair combed from one of her servant girls, and the girl had snagged her hair and had yanked out a chunk of her hair, and in pain, Elizabeth turned and reacted and smacked the girl so hard in the face that she got a nosebleed, and the blood got onto Elizabeth's hand. Well, the blood on her hand, supposedly, when she rubbed it in, it made her look youthful and young again. And this is supposed to be the stem of where the idea that she decided, I'm going to start bathing in the blood of these young girls and it's going to bring me eternal youth and make me look beautiful and young again. Which Elizabeth Bathory was rumored at the time to be a very beautiful woman, even from a very young age when she was a teenager. And they said that she was very gorgeous, a stunning woman of her time. And that, of course, she is supposed to be the idea that she wanted to keep that beauty. She wanted to keep that youth. Some of the crimes that they put into detail was the fact that some of the ways of torturing these girls that Elizabeth supposedly thrived on. She enjoyed torturing girls. She enjoyed their pain and their suffering, and that because she supposedly learned this from an aunt. But some of the things that they claimed that she did was that she would take some of the servants and she would get them completely drenched in water, and in the middle of the winter time she would stick them outside until they would literally freeze to death. And there are other accounts they would take stinging nettles and that they would press them against these poor girls until they were in such agony that they would scream out in pain. Some accounts say that she would take needles and jam them under the fingernails of some of their servants until, and in some accounts they would even say that they would stick these needles under the girls' fingers, and if the girls would remove the needles at any point in time on their own accord, that she would take a pair of scissors and she would cut off their fingers, which you heard me talk about the scissors before in my story, and of course they've been in some of the movies that we've talked about as well, because supposedly her favorite weapon of choice was these shears or large scissors. There are other accounts that some of the torture she did was that she would strip these girls down till they were bare naked and lie them on a table and have them completely covered in honey, and then would let the bees, wasps, and ants come in until they feasted on the skin of these poor girls and until they unfortunately succumbed to death. And yeah, I can't imagine dying from something like that. Yeah, some of this stuff that you research, it's like, yeah, I can see why people would think this was one of the most evil women on account, on record. Some of the other ways of torture, they would say that she had cannibalistic ways where she would literally bite the women and tear off their skin, and even says that she bit the breast of a woman at one point and even tore off her nipple. And yeah, no, I don't think so. But ow. But they also said that she took that poor girl, the same one that she bit off her breast, and forced the girl to cook some of her own flesh, and even forced her to eat it as well. So, no thanks. That gives a whole new meaning to dinner. Now, when it comes to the accounts where supposedly there were rumors around town that were talking about what Elizabeth was doing and how she was torturing her girls, and that she was finding all these different horrific ways of killing peasant girls, and supposedly because when she was killing the peasants, nobody was taking mind, nobody noticed. But when it came to the point when nobility was sending their younger daughters, because they were supposed to be getting etiquette training from Elizabeth Bathory, that when those girls started turning up missing or had died of mysterious ways, that's when they started questioning what was going on with Elizabeth Bathory. And one of the accounts that they talk about was that one of the girls supposedly had lost her mind while she was there under the care of Elizabeth Bathory, and had gone around and had killed several of the other servants before she had committed suicide herself. And when the family had asked Elizabeth for the body, she had claimed that no, that they had to take care of the body themselves in a special way because death by suicide was seen as a sin. Now, mind you, Bathory and her family were Protestant, but at the same time, through my research and everything, you come to find out that Elizabeth Bathory, with her indentured servants, she gave them freedom, that she allowed them to be Catholic on her lands, and that they could worship any god that they pleased, even though that the family themselves were Protestant. So things like this kind of start bringing up the idea of someone who's very stouch and will torture people. It seems very odd that she would be open for other people to have open religions and that. But at the same time, it just kind of starts bringing up the first of the questions to start going, that seems interesting, that if she's Protestant and if she's so forceful with everything else she does, why is she allowing her servants to be a different religion than what she is? We'll get into more evidence about things like that, and that are kind of related to the same idea of things to start questioning of, was this really what was going on back then? Or is this all hearsay? King Matthias II comes to Gregory Thurzo. Now, mind you, Thurzo is the good friend of Fernic, who had promised him on his deathbed that he would protect Elizabeth Bathory and take care of her. But when the king comes to him and starts telling him, hey, gather a crew, and I would like you to start gathering evidence against Elizabeth Bathory. Okay, so Thurzo decides, okay, well, I'm gonna go look for evidence, and what he finds is we have accounts from a letter that he had sent to his wife, that while investigating Elizabeth Bathory, they showed up one day. Now, mind you, they were invited over for dinner. So the story always was kind of like rumored that they had shown up, and they'd shown up in the middle of Elizabeth Bathory torturing one of the girls. But the true account is that they showed up on one day and had dinner with Elizabeth, and that supposedly they had found the dead girl in the courtyard, and that's when they started investigating, and then had found this torture room, this dungeon, and that they had found another girl that was near dead, and then another one whose body was burned in the fire pit in the room. So once again, several different stories kind of going on, and the one account just is a letter from Thurzo to his wife describing this situation that they had found. Now, here's where everything starts getting weird. So you have the court case that happens in 1610, but it's a very quick court case, and it's held in secret. And it's not even held in the town where Elizabeth Bathory lives, where the normal court cases happen. It happened in a small town in the Kingdom of Hungary, and since it was in secret, barely anybody knew about it. And supposedly, the fact was the idea that because of the noble Bathory family, they wanted it to be hush-hush and kept quiet in a secret, that's why it was done that way. Now, other records and historians have been doing their own digging and research, and they're wondering if this was done as a backwards way of not causing a big uproar, because what the king and Thurzo were doing was very illegal even at that time. So they hold this small court case, and Elizabeth Bathory is never able to stand in court. She's never able to defend herself, and she's never held on trial. It's her servants who are held on trial, because Elizabeth Bathory supposedly had 4 servants who helped her. Although I also found on record that there were 5. So that kind of changes from here and there, that if there's 4 servants that helped her or if there were 5, but that her servants were held on record. Now, the evidence that Thurzo and his men had gotten that would be the damning evidence against Elizabeth Bathory was done by torture. So all of their witnesses, every single one of them that were her servants, were tortured in order to get a confession. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're not trained for torture, generally, any Joe Schmo is just going to regurgitate whatever it is that the person who is hurting you, torturing you, you're just going to tell them exactly what they want to hear. So it's also important to note that every single one of these servants that had a confession, all their stories were different. That's why over the years, if you go through all the records about how she tortured these girls, what she had done to them, every single story is completely different. So all the evidence is different. But it makes Elizabeth look awful. It makes her look like a terrible, torturous, murderous villain. So she became the Blood Countess. And so all of her servants, I'm going to look at their names. I'm going to butcher them. So I already apologize. But Alana Jo, Dorothea Sventez, Janos Zavanveri, who was a very young disabled boy who, when he was executed, it was very quick because they claimed that because he was young, he didn't know any better, so they had beheaded him. And Ursi Majorova, which the 3 older servants, they did not have a peaceful execution, unfortunately. And the last one, Katerina Benica, had a life sentence to be imprisoned. And there are also some accounts where they believe that because Katerina was bullied by the other servants into being forced to do torture and being forced to do what she was to do, that they kind of state that because of the life sentence and she wasn't executed, that they think over time that they even released her and let her live the rest of her life in peace. But that's just hearsay. That's just not on the record. Anything that I say today, let's just say, is allegedly. So we're going with allegedly today. Now, as I stated, Elizabeth was not able to stand on trial herself. She was not able to defend herself. And one of the other things that's interesting to note is that when she got known as the Blood Countess who bathed in blood, there is no record in any of these court cases that were found that even states that. And how Elizabeth even came to be, because when she went on trial, all of her servants were executed except for the one who had the life sentence. When she was found guilty, her crime, at first they were going to put her in the nunnery, because remember, Thurzo was a family friend. He was supposed to protect her and take care of her. So instead of her being killed, because she's a noble on top of that, it would be very frowned upon to do something like that. It would also bring a lot of questions to people. So at first the idea was they were going to hide her in a nunnery, is that she would have to spend the rest of her days living as a nun. Well, then it turned into, well, that's not going to work. So she had a life sentence to be confined in a tower in her own castle. And that they walled up every window, and supposedly when they locked up the door, they had a few slits that were enough for her to have air and for her to get food and water. And that even her death to this day can be seen as being mysterious and under very strange situation because of the fact that, so mind you, she was found guilty in 1610. And since it was a very quick court case, because she was arrested in December of 1610, and she passed away in 1614, so it's only 4 years later. And as the story and the accounts go, that the guard that was to her room, because obviously she is house arrest, but they have a guard on duty, that she complained about her hands being cold, and that the guard just basically stated, "It's nothing, mistress, just go back to bed." And that she never woke up again after that. And that the next day she was found dead in her room. So, very mysterious in how her death could have been. We don't know if she could have possibly been poisoned or anything like that. Once again, allegedly. And of course, I'm also going to apologize if I'm all over the place with this, because I mean, there's so much information on here. And that's why I am going to link my sources in here, and I would love for you to watch their videos and to look at their sources and their investigations and everything that they have learned, because they have done some deep diving, where mine was just out of interest and what I originally thought when I was going into this of what Elizabeth Bathory was, because in my head, she's the prolific female murderess of the world, and that she's most well known for being the Blood Countess, that she bathed in the blood of her victims so that she could be young and beautiful, and that she was a vampire, and she was evil, and this and that. And that she supposedly had killed over 650 young girls and women. So we have to go to where the court case happened, and the Bathory family wanted it to be kept hush-hush. So all records of this trial were hidden, and nobody knew about it. 100 years later, it isn't until a historian, which I'm going to look at this, because otherwise I'm going to butcher this name completely off, like, way off base, but scholar Laszlo Toroszczy in 1729 had published his own book because he had found the records. So this is how long after the fact of the court case happening, and because her death was in 1614, so for him, after 100 years finally coming across all these records of the court case and that, he's actually the one who started the rumor that she bathed in the blood of the women, because he made the book and stated that. So he's the one who brought up the story of the servant girl that she had hit in the face, and with the blood on her hand, she saw that her skin looked youthful and young again, and then transpired into the story that we all know as the Blood Countess who bathed in the blood of her victims. Now, this is where it all starts and stems, but because of him finding these hidden records that were supposedly hidden away from the king, from the Bathory family, because they didn't want the embarrassment of the fact of their family having a soiled reputation of this terrible person, and that she would torture these girls by freezing them to death, or even in some cases that she would brand them with hot tongs and keys and coins, which you would have seen in my story at one point, where kind of referencing to the keys and things like that, that she supposedly would heat them up and would brand women, or the girls, with these hot items. It starts from there to where it's 400 years later, and we're still talking about Elizabeth Bathory, but at the same time, there's historians who have done documentation of going and finding these different items and ways of torture, which, like I said, so many records of the servants all had a different story, and supposedly there were 300 different testimonies of condemning Elizabeth Bathory for being this terrible, murderous person. And come to find out that she, on her land, had hired 2 healers, that they were supposed to be taking care of her indentured servants and the people in her land. So right there, they're kind of on record with, okay, so why would you have healers if you were just planning on killing all these people? Why would you take the time to have healers for the people on your land if you don't really care about anybody but yourself? And on top of that, historians have also been finding that a lot of these tortures that they did back then, her and her servants, because at the time when you were the noble, it's your land, you were in charge of taking care of your people. 9 times out of 10, they usually are the ones who also help with the healing. Some of the many different ways, which, like I said, I'm going to link Illuminati's video, and I really, really hope that you all will go and watch her video, because it's going to be way more in depth than what mine is. And what she found was that a lot of these common diseases that happened back then, that a lot of these things that were dubbed as torture were remedies back then. And it's like, wow, like, it's mind-blowing. Like I said, this was like the weirdest roller coaster, because come to find out that the tongs, the hot tongs, or this prod that she would use to supposedly brand these girls and torture them with, when they found this device, this was known as a medical device for cauterizing wounds. So anytime that somebody would be injured and was bleeding to death, that they, back then, they would burn the wound and they would brand it and seal it with these devices. So one of these torture things was that. One of the other ones, it's gonna sound gross, but the needles being jammed under the fingernails was because of seamstresses would get this infection. I apologize, I don't remember what the actual term is, but like I said, I'm gonna link her video in there. She has all the technical terms in there, and her source as well. And that they would put underneath because of the infection, so in order to drain it, they would stab underneath the nail with a needle and they would drain out the infection. It sounds incredibly painful and terrible, and there was no penicillin back then. There was no invention of penicillin, so that's how they did it. All these different ways of what we would dub as torture was ways of healing back then. There was also other times when they would, it's gonna sound gross, but if you had a headache, they would even put small holes in your head to try and relieve the pressure of, to relieve the pressure of the headache. But obviously, sometimes that would even kill a person anyways, because, don't drill into your skull. Don't drill a hole into your heads. That's not going to go well in any way or form. But back then, they saw it as a remedy. And including there were certain diseases that they would put them in intense heat and then put them in intense cold because it was a certain way to try and fight and battle off the fever and the temperature. So one of the tortures that they brought up was the fact of them having to stand outside in the cold. So it's just these weird accounts trying to think, where did these servants come up with these? So maybe they took things that were from reality that they do remember, because let's face it, it would be a traumatic experience for anybody to go through. I mean, it's a form to try and save them, but they would just bring up anything that they could remember on hand and say, this is how she tortured us, this is what she did to us. And they're being tortured by officers, and in order to get it to stop, they would just regurgitate anything they could think of in order to stop the pain. And that's why you have so many different accounts of how she was torturing and hurting people. Now, all accusations against Elizabeth Bathory are based on rumor. There's actually no document out there that states that anybody complained about her before Thurzo started investigating her. And one of the things that they go into detail about was the fact that they waited until her husband, Faranek, had passed away, and that they didn't start accusing her of these things because supposedly the crown of the Kingdom of Hungary, so the Habsburg family, and King Matthias II supposedly owed her a heavy debt, like a ridiculous amount of debt. And mind you, the kingdom has already felt slighted by the Bathory family, and because the Bathory family also favored their cousins who were in the Transylvania area. Of course, the crown doesn't want to owe money to anyone, so what better way to seize the debt or seize her property than to condemn her of these horrific, horrible crimes? And let's face it, it is easy back then to make a woman just disappear. And they essentially did make her disappear. And it's a scary thing to think about at the same time, that something like this, she could have been innocent. She might not be the murderess that we all think she is. And 400 years later, we're still talking about her, and talking about her as if she's got the world record for being the most prolific female murderer out there. And she could be innocent, essentially. Now, it's not to say that she wasn't a hard-ass woman. She could be mean, she could be ruthless, she was a ruler, she was a leader of her land. And she could be brutal with her punishments. So we're not going to say that she was fuzzy and warm, and even the Illuminati states this herself as well. But she was a fighter and a hard ass, and she would punish her servants if they were in the wrong. So no, we're not going to say that she was 100% like in the right. But she might not be this murderess that they claim that she would be. Now, she's not the person that... There's no way she would have killed 650 women and girls. There's no way that she could have gotten... Especially since nobody came forward before Thurzo started doing his investigation. Nobody was complaining against her. So it's all hearsay after the fact of the rumors. When the court case happened, it became a witch hunt. So that's when everyone started saying all these rumors about her, and that they didn't want her to be around anymore. She was originally buried in the cemetery, and supposedly there was an uproar, and they forced them to move the body because they didn't want to be in the cemetery with a murderess. But at the same time, if you supposedly went to where she was supposed to be buried today, her body's not there. Which could make a fun story of saying maybe she really was a vampire and that's why her body's not there. But that's just us being funny and silly. Gotta be lighthearted at some point in these kind of videos. But her body, you can't find it. and there's no record of where her body was moved to, which could be another thing that the Bathory family had decided to do. Now, mind you, since the Bathory family wanted to keep it private and they wanted to keep the property, they didn't want it seized by the crown, basically the debt was forgiven. So there's just so many weird little details in this whole entire situation, and I could go on and on and on and on about this whole entire thing, but it's just something to think about, to kind of have in the back of your mind, and that you can do any kind of research on your own that you want to do. And like I said, please listen to the sources that I provide in here. Bailey Sarian's just kind of a fun one. Hers doesn't go along the route of that the possibility she could be innocent. Hers is around the same old version that most of us have heard, is that she is a vampire and a terrible murderous lady. Yeah, no, the usual that we hear. But I just wanted to bring it up for the fact of what if she was innocent? Yes, she was a hard ass and she could be a brutal punisher to people who have betrayed her or anyone that she could punish, just like her parents had done before her. And unfortunately, it was a different time back then, and that's what they did. They tortured people, they whipped people, they flogged people, and terrible things. But was she a murderer? I mean, there's a strong possibility that she wasn't. So, putting it out there into the universe that a woman that we may have been learning over time might not be as terrible as what we thought. And maybe over time, more researchers will be able to do some deep diving. But in the end, we're never gonna know. Never gonna know. Because even anybody who's found these documentations, this is 100 years past the fact of, and we never know if her family had any form of diary or record or anything of this. And supposedly Elizabeth Bathory did, but nobody's found this diary or journal that supposedly has record of all of her accounts of what she has done. Nobody's found it. Same with we've never found her. But thank you for listening to my ramblings about Elizabeth Bathory and the possible true crime of, was she a murderer or was she innocent? We may never ever know in our time. But as always, I want to thank you for joining me on this, and thank you for listening to my rumble jumble of my notes and everything that's in my head, because I mean, my head could literally explode with all the information that I've taken on for this case. And I'm glad that I did the research that I did, because I had no idea. I never in a million years would have thought that this is where my brain would think about Elizabeth Bathory. But here we are!
Surprise!
But stemming away from Elizabeth and her tragic tale, or, I mean, did she get her just dessert? We don't know. We really don't. But wanted to move into another section where wanted to apologize for the fact that I didn't post a video last week. I had intended that, of course, Elizabeth Bathory was supposed to be for the month of June, but I've been having an extremely rough time in my personal life, just between with work and just life stress in general. Can't go too into details or anything like that, but I'm just drained. And doing my YouTube videos has been my therapy. And I love doing this kind of stuff. And personally, if I could make this a full-time job, like if I could get the following that everybody would dream of, so that you could, you know, make the money and everything and actually turn it into a career. I would love that, and to be able to make videos all the time, and because then that would mean I could quit at my job, and because my full-time job takes up all of my time and all of my space in here. And like I said, doing this kind of stuff is therapeutic for me, but at the same time, when I get home from work and I don't even want to cook myself food or do anything simple like do my dishes because I'm just so exhausted mentally and physically, that so for having me to sit in front of a camera, especially for this video where I'm just so overwhelmed and so nervous about bringing up facts that, you know, I mean, it's kind of an opinion piece in itself because of the fact that this is just how I feel about it now. But anyway, I'm rambling at this point. I appreciate every single one of you that joins me here and that you give me a piece of your time, because I know how important our time is. And thank you. Thank you for being here with me, and I appreciate you. Anyway, I'm rambling again. So thank you for being here, obviously. And you can find me, Charcy Luxx, on my Twitter. That is for Charcy Luxx with 3 X's. You can also find me on my Instagram for Charcy87. I have another YouTube channel that I do with my friend DC called Little Channel of Horrors. And we are going to move into the month of July, which it is July now, and it is Dead Girl Summer. We're going to get more lighthearted with this one. I have a lot of my cheesy horror movies that I'm going to get into, and going to come up with a fun ghost story for that one as well. But thank you so much for joining me here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your evening, the rest of your night, whatever time of the day it is. I hope you have a good one. Bye! When I just now realized I never turned the ring light on. Oopsie!